Stefan from the University of Munich. So today we will have three different topics. The first one is about macroevolution, so that means long timescales, as Monty mentioned yesterday, very long timescales, up to hundreds of millions of years, or even billions of years. The second one is then about speciation, and the third one about natural selection and adaptation. So the third one is then on the time scale of the effective population size. This is the shortest time scale. So the first speaker is Charles Marshall from UC Berkeley. He is a paleontologist, but he uses also methods from genomics and developmental biology to understand mechanisms that he told me. Okay, so please, Charles.
Okay, thanks very much. So I was given a small thing to do today in 45 minutes, and it was really much too generous in time, so I've decided to do it a little bit faster. And I'm going to show this again at the end, and hopefully you'll appreciate the skill they put together in doing this. So I'm going to do it now in 96 seconds instead. Starting with the Big Bang. So you've got to create the elements, of course, that life depends upon. So bang. Formation of the sun, Earth. Heavy bombardment, we'll see. Creation of the moon. There's the Earth. Plate tectonics, I'm not going to talk about. Cells, genetic information, origin of life, prokaryotes, Ediacarans, Cambrian explosion, climate change, vertebrates, that's a chicken, invade land, change the extinction, bolides, mammals inherit the earth, primates emerge, and then the capacity for self-reflection, which I'm not going to talk much about. So what I want to do is...
It wasn't to scale.
Sorry? Well, actually, it is. It's the movie time goes something like the reciprocal of log real time. I'll show you that at the end. I checked it last night. Pseudo works. Okay, so what I'm going to do is basically walk you around the clock of the history of the planet fairly rapidly to give you a sense of the major events and the waiting times between events, which I think is particularly important. So the Earth forms at about 4.55 billion years ago. The formation of the moon is about 30 to 50 million years later, hard to know exactly. Looks like a collision with a Mars-sized-like body. It produced the tilt on the Earth's axis. So our seasons and our lunar cycles come from that collision. Of course, our biology today still has lunar cycles in it. Female menstrual cycles still tuned to monthly cycles, even though it doesn't tune to the moon anymore. So that legacy is still with us 4.5 billion years later. It's really interesting too, we have meteorites called pallasites that look like they're derived from core mantle boundaries of destroyed planets. And so here are olivines that come from the mantle and iron and nickel that look like they're derived from the core. So we have evidence of these things independent of the models. So the oldest evidence of Earth's history on Earth itself are crystals at about 4.4 billion. And they are zircons, and they suggest that the crust was at least cool enough at that time to form crystals of this kind. So it must have been cool at about 900 degrees Celsius. So it's still a little bit cookie if you're interested in life. The oldest rocks are at about 4 billion, and they've only recently been discovered, and they're massively metamorphosed, so there's not much information in them. And then slightly less cooked rocks are at 3.8 billions from the Isua group in Greenland. And so this period from the formation of the planet to about 3.8 billion years is called the Hadean, reflecting the fact that we basically have no information as to what's going on there. And so then our rock record starts at about here. So the age of the Earth itself is actually estimated from moon rock ages and meteorites from the pre-solar nebula that have fallen to Earth. That's how we get the age of the planet. So that's the oldest rocks. Some of these rocks have phosphate grains that have carbon in it, and those carbon isotopes, carbon-12 to carbon-13 ratio, is highly fractionated in exactly the way you'd expect if that carbon had gone through an organism that had Rubisco. So there's an argument from the carbon isotopes that life was already present at this time, including things like photosynthetic organisms with Rubisco. Hard to know whether it's true. So then origin of life then, probably by 3.8 billion. As the planet formed, there's heavy bombardment of giant objects that crater the moon and Mars, and the thought is that if life predated that, it would have been obliterated. My suspicion is the evolution of life is fairly easy, so I'm of the camp that life actually originated several times and probably got blinked out of existence by these massive impacts in this early phase here. But life that we're interested in, that is us, looks like it started somewhere before 3.5 billion years ago, and the end of the heavy bombardment, which is in the order of 4 billion, don't know when exactly. Just want to remind you that faint early sun, that the sun increased in luminosity about 50% over its luminosity at that time of the origin of life, for what that's worth. So now origin of life is an incredibly easy problem. You just put some E. coli on a plate and they grow. So it's really, really hard. And so I'm going to try to sort of capture some of the essence of it, but I really don't understand it. I don't think anybody does. Why is it hard? Organisms are very complex. We have only data for one origin. That doesn't make things good. It happened a long time ago, probably in the Hadean, so we don't have much data. And fundamentally, the other reason is the conditions on the Earth are fundamentally different from now. There's no free oxygen, which is destructive of complex molecules today, and there was no life. Life is incredibly capable of sucking out resources, so you can't build up the precursors of life in today's world because it sucks. Life basically destroys any precursors. So it makes it very hard to understand it. Working backwards in time from the universal tree of life, we have the last universal common ancestor. It's a single-cell prokaryote. The first organisms were probably much simpler than this, so it doesn't help, and were probably fundamentally different, and we'll get to that in a moment. So what we have today is not all that helpful. Okay, we need a definition of life if you understand how it evolves. So here's my definition: functioning entities that include the capacity to replicate themselves. I don't want to get stuck in definitions. You need an inside and an outside. Highly desirable is the capacity to function and replicate in a varying environment. Organisms have very sophisticated controls that regulate function. This might not have been present in the first life. So I'm not going to deal with the issue of control, which I think is incredible for complex organisms. Yes?
So if in the RNA world hypothesis, so if you have RNA worlds that are able to replicate themselves, they don't count because they're not...
We'll get to it. We'll get to it. We'll get to it. So the other critical thing is to recognize that life builds from the bottom up. For example, we break our food down into the component parts, proteins to amino acids, carbohydrates to simple sugars, etc. And then we build everything from scratch: protein, blood cells, muscles, organs, etc. Now there are some exceptions. So this nudibranch here will steal the stinging cells of things like blue bottles and stick them inside there. But for the most part, we don't actually just borrow things off the shelf the way we go when we go to the hardware store to buy refrigerators and stoves, etc. We build from the bottom up. That means we need instructions for making the proteins, right? And so organisms achieve this using DNA. I'm ignoring RNA viruses, my apology. And there's the machinery for taking those instructions and converting them to protein, etc. So a very, very strange way of building things. So how life functions: organisms' ability to acquire and use raw resources for the production of energy, to synthesize the cell's machinery, to reproduce and grow. These functions are typically carried out by proteins. And I just want to remind you that metabolism is really complex. As human metabolism, and first organisms probably had vastly simpler metabolisms. Well, there's a surprise. So key steps in the origin of life then: you've got to make the building blocks, you've got to concentrate the building blocks, you've got to make an inside and an outside, you've got to establish metabolism, and you've got to develop the ability to replicate. So making the building blocks is probably relatively straightforward. Here's just actually a spectral line showing that there are even fairly complex carbon molecules in free space. So anytime there's energy flow, it's fairly easy to generate molecular complexity. Urey-Miller experiments, artificial lightning in a mixture of gases with no oxygen, produces a bunch of amino acids, etc. So the fundamental precursor seems like a fairly easy problem, relatively speaking. Open questions: what were the compositions of the Earth's early atmosphere? Where were the building blocks built harder? In the atmosphere, hydrothermal vents at the seafloor splitting ridges, open ocean, clay surfaces, fresh water. Seems harder to build the components for DNA and RNA, particularly RNA that's highly reactive, than for proteins and lipids. Okay, concentrating the building blocks need restricted environments or a way of concentrating the building blocks, and a lot of work these days is concentrating on clays as an attractive model because they can see as templates not just for concentration but for polymerization, which is necessary if you want to grow an RNA or a DNA for the first time. Making insides and outsides seems fairly straightforward. Next slide. Getting the key molecules inside, I don't know how we even think about that problem properly. And so making protocells is easy. All you need is linear molecules that have an oily and water-soluble ends, and these are fairly easy to make. Now, getting the stuff in and out is more complicated. Okay, establishing metabolism and developing the ability to replicate. Chicken and egg problem referred to there. Cells need proteins to read and replicate DNA. DNA is needed to make proteins. Today, organisms can't make proteins without DNA, but can't make DNA without proteins. So how do you get this started? And of course, the RNA world, the discovery of ribosomes is the solution. They can act as enzyme as well as information storage. Suggest the first organisms, or at least an early stage in the evolution of life, was organized around RNAs. And then later, information storage was taken over by DNA, and most of the metabolism by proteins. And we don't really understand those processes either. But I'd like to note that a lot of the key processes in our cells have RNAs buried in their core. The ribosomal RNA is part of the ribosome. It's a tRNA that brings the amino acids in. The DNA is first converted into a messenger RNA, which is then read by the ribosome, which is carried by the tRNAs. So at the heart of all of our machinery, you see RNA there, which I think lends heavy credence to the idea that RNA is sort of at the root of early evolution of cells. So that's all I'm going to do on the origin of life, because I think it's too hard to go the next step without an awful lot of speculation and hard chemistry. So origin of life, another possibility. Life came from elsewhere. Motivation for the idea. Maybe it's so hard to explain the origin of life on Earth because it didn't happen here. That seems a little lame. But it might be true, right? So you can't just dismiss it just because it postpones the problem.
I was just wondering, sorry I didn't ask this when you were on the RNA side, but what's the current best theory for origin of RNA world? I mean, as far as precursors.
I don't know. I think clay is for the polymerization issue, but I'm not up to the full up to speed with the RNA world. So the other issue is if life originated elsewhere, how did it get here? And I think this is just a fun fact, which a lot of astrobiologists are working on, which is, we now have about 120 meteorites from Mars. Their isotopical and chemical compositions are very clearly indicate that they are actually from Mars. And so if you can somehow rather get resting stages trapped in sediment, something smacks in and blows a rock off. This one is unbelievably old. This thing called Black Beauty was just dated a few weeks ago at 2.1 billion. A lot of them look much younger and look like they're in space for 1 to 20 million years. So if you believe that things can sit there for that long and still be viable, then fine. So, finally, I just want to note there seems to be a massive transfer of genetic information between species early in the history of life. So there we have animals, fungi, and plants at the top of the eukaryotic tree here. I think the degree of genetic transfer between species is overestimated. I've never seen a proper discussion of the fact that there's phylogenetic error. So if you have 3 major domains of life, eukaryotes, archaea, and bacteria, and they're all very closely related to each other, then by random chance alone, you'll get different molecules supporting different combinations of the pairs, and those are always interpreted as evidence of horizontal transfer. It could just be error in actually getting the correct topology right. So I think there's less than people think, but there's still evidence, plenty of evidence of horizontal transfer occurring. So is this the beginning of sex? In some sense, yes, in the sense that there's the reticulation in the evolutionary process early on. Okay, so now what I want to do, having kind of ducked, yes?
Sorry, I was just going to ask in general, so why is it tempting to talk about life originating elsewhere? Doesn't that just push the same problem further away from us?
Yeah. I don't see it. If that's your motivation, then I don't think it solves any problems. But maybe it actually happened. So, yeah. So, first fossils are at about 3.5 billion. So, over 1 billion years since the origin of the planet that we actually have evidence of life. And it's a little controversial. These are the fossils from Bill Schoff at UCLA. He identifies them as cyanobacteria. Simon Brazier at Oxford is challenging their authenticity, period. So it's unclear now whether these things actually count as evidence of life or not. So that's an open debate. However, at the same place, in the same localities in Western Australia, we have stromatolites at the same age. Here are living stromatolites from Shark Bay in Western Australia. They're layered structures made by the binding and cementation of sedimentary grains by biofilms of microorganisms, rare today because large organisms eat the biofilms. The water here is incredibly salty, so there aren't any other taxa in there to eat these things. And you can slice them open as these layered structures. Sometimes you get microfossils preserved in them, so these are the living ones. And there's lots of fossil ones, and they start at about 3.5 billion. So that suggests that there are bacterial communities at about 3.5 billion. A group at MIT now at Caltech has asked the question, how do you know that these are not formed by inorganic or organic processes? And some of these may actually be inorganic rather than organic, and that's another area of debate that's ongoing. Okay, so origin of life. So oldest record of life in the order of 3.5 billion. So now I'm going to jump ahead to the beginning of the accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere and oceans. So up until this point, there's been no free oxygen that we're aware of on the history of the planet, period. Oxygen is being produced, but it's being consumed. That's very interesting to me. That's 1 billion years or 1.5 billion years. So how long is that in real time? So I think if you're an evolutionist, real time is measured in generations. So I don't know how many generations of bacteria there are in a year, a week, a day. So let's say 3 a day, because that gives me 1,000 a year, which means I've got 10 to the 12 generations from here to here, 10 to the 12 generations. How many populations of bacteria are there in the world? Anybody want to give a guess? I don't know. Let's say 10 to the 12, 10 to the 10, 10 to the 6. So that gives you 10 to the 18, 10 to the 20, 10 to the 24 independent populations exploring the combinatorial potential of their genome. So that's what 1 billion years is. It's a phenomenal amount of time for inventing things. And I think that's a useful way to think about geologic time. As we'll see, time starts to compress as we get further up here. Generation times drop to about 1 a year. So the rate of evolution and exploration slowly drops as we go through the history of life, ignoring bacteria. So that's a really important number. So oxygen begins to accumulate in the atmosphere. The evidence for the rise of oxygen, at about this time, what we find is the rusting of the oceans. So prior to 2.45, most of the iron in the ocean is Fe2+, it's water soluble. And then as oxygen is produced, it goes to Fe3+ and comes out of solution into massive iron formations. And so almost all of the world's great iron ore deposits, this one also happens to be Western Australia, and also the world's great uranium deposits also date from this time. Reduced uranium is soluble in water, oxidized uranium is not. So you get an incredible concentration of a lot of metals and heavy elements at this time. The second one, and I do not understand this, is there is a mass-independent fractionation of sulfur isotopes that is measured until 2.45 billion years ago. It's a quantum effect that I do not understand in the upper atmosphere. When you get to about 0.1% current levels of oxygen, that's enough shielding of cosmic rays that you no longer get that mass-independent fractionation of sulfur, and it just vanishes. So that seems like a fairly hard number, that we're about 0.1% oxygen at about 2.45. We don't know how long it takes to go to 1%, 10%, etc. Accumulation of oxygen, I call it the great poisoning. I mean, humans are kind of poisoning the world, but not in the way that cyanobacteria did once they depleted all the major sinks. Right, from a world that's fully free of oxygen to one that has it abundant with all its sort of caustic effects. So oxygen was produced bacteria, which may have evolved 1 billion years earlier. So that's a really slow time bomb working away, right? And then boom, once the sinks are gone, it starts to accumulate. So here's just a diagram showing the time scale Hadean at the beginning, running to the present up here. And this is a graph of our precision of oxygen levels on log space. Very hard to measure oxygen in the rock records, so we really can't do it much, well, 0.1%, 1%, 10%, and we don't know how it rises through the emergence of animals, and that's an ongoing area of inquiry. Okay, first fossil eukaryotes. So far the world has been dominated by bacteria, mostly anaerobic processes. The oldest fossil eukaryotes may be at 2.1 billion. There are disputed eukaryotic cell membrane derivatives found in oils that go to 2.7 billion. These are the biomarkers. So 2.7 is in here somewhere. So if that's true, that means that eukaryotes originated in this anaerobic world. And I think there's evidence now that mitochondria, in fact, at their ancestral state were actually anaerobic, not aerobic. A lot of people want to tie the origin of eukaryotes to the origin of oxygen because mitochondria deal with oxygen. But I think what's happened is the mitochondria of the world have got very good at oxygen because they've had 2.5 billion years to evolve to it. So having eukaryotes in here is no problem with respect to mitochondria. But who knows? And the issue here is that people are now claiming that these oils are actually contaminants from other oil bodies. And so that again is on working. Joachim Brox at ANU. Roger Summons at MIT. So the fundamental building block of life is the cell. I know we tend to concentrate on DNA and RNA, but the building block is the cell. This is the level of organization with instructions inside. And I just remind you that the nucleus has 2 membranes in its own DNA. Mitochondria have 2 membranes in its own DNA, indication of symbiotic events. The other thing that's important, chloroplasts also, of course, plants also have chloroplast, endosymbiotic origin. And I just want to remind you that there have been multiple endosymbiotic origins involving the photosynthetic machinery. Each of these circles represents evidence of an endosymbiotic event. Mitochondria seem to only occur once, the purple bacteria, but the cyanobacteria engulfment, they get passed on between different lineages. Sizes of things, eukaryotes tend to be bigger than prokaryotes, which tend to be bigger than viruses, etc. Why is it important? These are the fossils that are ascribed as the earliest eukaryotes. There's bazillions of them. There was one fossil about 800 million years found in India, and then an uncountable number in Ishpeming in Michigan. The large size and the coiled morphology, which implies it has a cytoskeleton, eukaryotic invention, suggests it's eukaryotic. So this is what the trick of paleontology. It's hard to know anything with any real decent rigor. In fact, one of my best friends in first year undergraduate in Australia still razzes me. Said, "Are you doing science yet, Charles?" She quit paleontology and geology after a year and now a neurobiologist because this is too soft for her. Anyway, and then starting at about 1.9 billion, we have lots and lots of fossils of these things called acritarchs that are in the order of up to 1 millimeter and have these spiny processes, and some of the preservation shows vesicles inside. So that really suggests that eukaryotes are definitely relatively common by 1.9 billion. It wouldn't surprise me if it's earlier than that, given that they don't preserve all that well. Eukaryotic multicellularity by 1.2 billion, it wouldn't surprise me if it's a lot older than that. And the reason is in part, this 1.2, is multicellularity has evolved at least 24 times in the history of life. And so what do you mean by multicellularity? Animal multicellularity is going to be much later. And so I just remind you that lots of bacteria are multicellular. Some of them have colonies. These guys have cellular differentiation. These are the heterocysts of cyanobacteria. There's about 1,000 unique genes that are expressed in the heterocysts alone. It's when you starve them of, nitrogen. They set up an oxygen-free environment here and can fix nitrogen. And then there are things that are not really multicellular, but sort of. So slime molds live most of their lives as single-celled amoeba. But when it's time to reproduce, they form a multicellular structure and produce spores. So a lot of organisms, it's not a hard and fast line between single and multicellular. So the oldest red fossil alga, as far as we know, living fossil, about 1.2 billion years old. My suspicion is that multicellularity is quite a lot older than that. The fossil record and the rock record is very weak back there. And by about 500 million years, there's lots of algal groups found in the fossil record. Oh, I'm going really fast. So be it. So first animals are at about 580 million years ago. That's almost 4 billion years of history until you get to the first animals. Yeah.
When you say multicellularity was started 24 times,
Yeah.
what exactly does that mean? I mean, in what way were these 24 different?
So animals, plants, fungi, red algae, gold algae, green algae, and then there are a bunch of protist groups that have multiple cells, and then there are a couple of bacterial groups. So something where there is a series of individuals linked together in a non-facultative way.
And they are parallel evolutions rather than sequential.
They're definitely parallel. Completely and utterly independent origins. Yeah. Okay, so animals at 580 million years. Oils are organic molecules. They're derived often from the lipids of organisms, and there are biomarkers that seem to be sponge-specific in oils that date back to about 750 million years. So it's possible, that's the reason why the green line's starting there. So it's possible that sponges were there by about 750 million years. Yeah.
What's an animal?
What's an animal?
Yeah. As opposed to what's an eukaryote.
An animal is a type of multicellular eukaryote.
It's just like a phylogeny. There's no distinction other than the phylogeny.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then retrospectively, you can come up with a bunch of definitions that everything that relates to us has.
So it's just like an arbitrary point, isn't it?
Well, I don't know what you mean by arbitrary. I mean, there's a unique history of life.
No, right, but I could define it like, one junction back in the tree. And then
No, because then it wouldn't be multicellular. Obligate multicellular. So it's a eukaryotic lineage. So there are multiple eukaryotic lineages that have become obligately multicellular.
Okay.
And one of those are the animals.
Okay.
And that happened independently of that question from plants and fungi and red algae, the kelp, and green algae, etc. Yeah, okay.
So
Yeah.
how far in time are these, the origins of these 24?
Sorry?
How far in time are they situated?
Most of the algal groups spread through here. In terms of if you use molecular phylogeny of the living groups and then do some crude molecular clock analysis with some of those fossils as calibration, they're through here. It's hard to know exactly. I can go back to this thing here. Oops, sorry. Oh dear. Okay, I've committed myself now. Whoops, sorry.
While you're taking this,
So here's the yeah.
excuse me, I just want, could you comment on the terrestrial versus aquatic transitions?
Yeah, I'm getting to that.
Oh,
Yeah.
it hasn't happened yet?
No, it hasn't happened yet. I'm going to keep going. I'll keep going and then I'll ask a question. Why don't I just keep going, get the narrative finished, and then we can answer some of these questions. So everything so far has been in the ocean. It's a good question. There's a bias there, of course, because ocean sediment comes in and traps there. So I've just reviewed a paper for Science which has euglenoid-type protists in freshwater deposits in the order of 1 billion. But freshwater deposits are very rare compared to marine records. So let's just keep going. So the first animals were in the ocean at 570. So I go back. 580 million years. Possibility that sponges go back to 750 million years. The Cambrian explosion of animals, which is the origin of the major animal body plans, is at about 540 million years. And what I'm going to do in my second talk is concentrate on the Cambrian explosion, partly because it's of major importance for us, but also because what I want to try to do in the second talk is try to inch into the problem of how do you come up with generalities rather than just simply description of unique events, which is what the history of life is and what I'm doing today in this talk. So plants invade land at about 500 million years ago. There are pollen that look like they're from terrestrial plants. Bacteria, I bet, invaded land way back here somewhere. So I think the invasion of land by life is actually really, really old. And fungi, I don't know, but fungi have an origin somewhere in here. So lichens and things like that can't be much before that. And so then, while they invade land at the 0.5, they don't get tallish until about 400 million years ago. I mean, tallish, like 6 meters or so. And flowering plants don't emerge until about 125 million years ago. So the flora that we see today around us is a very recent addition to the history of life. So algae invade the land at about 500. It looks like evolved from a freshwater green alga. There's the living one. There's the oldest fossil one. This is the nearest living relative of terrestrial plants based on molecular phylogenetic work. How do you do it? And I think this is important because I want to try to open the discussion of, is major events in the history of life variation limited, or is it environment change in boundary conditions limited? So you start with the green alga, you cover it in a waterproof coat called the cuticle, you stick holes in it, the stomata, so you can get air in and out, and you make waterproof coating for your spores, and that's basically it. So that's how you make the transition. And so the first land plants were probably things like simple mosses. So that's not very big, so how do you make something bigger? You've got to develop pipes to get water and nutrient from the ground, a vascular system. And shortly after that, you've got to evolve roots. So this is some of these moss-like things that the early plant fossil record start to develop roots, some of these fossils. Got to strengthen the stem, you've got to invent lignins or something like that to make the stem so you're stiff against gravity. And you've got to evolve leaves, and it turns out that happened twice independently. And it looks like it took about 40 million years after the evolution of the pipes. Lots of CO2 in the atmosphere then, perhaps 10, 15, 20 times current levels, 10, 15, 20 times, not 50% more. So maybe CO2 acquisition just isn't a problem for plants at that stage. They don't really need leaves. But two independent origins twice. And so here, time on the bottom, looks like, plants sort of just basically had no height. There's Cooksonia that I showed you, and it takes a while before you get to, this is a meter scale here. There are about 30 odd phyla of animals. Only about 5 have got onto land. And so you obviously can't get onto land until there's something to eat on land. And so insects invade the land at about 30 million years, and this is what the forests look like. I always get razzed by my wife when it comes to this, because for her a forest has to have a canopy. She's from Southeast Asia. This obviously has no canopy yet, so it really isn't a forest. And there's some beauties in the fossil record of some rather large arthropods. The vertebrate invasion of land a little bit later. So this is what the forests, in quote, would have looked like about 365 million years ago. This looks like we evolved from something like this. This is a very small shark with fish that have muscle and bone in their fins. And so it turns out we have a beautiful set of intermediate fossils showing the transition of the limb from the fin to our limb. And so the key step initially is have evolution of fins with bone and muscle in them. So there are about 29,000 living species of fish. There's probably more than that. None of them have bone or muscle in their fins, right? They've just got these fin rays, if you think of your goldfish or something like that. But there are 2 that have muscle and bone, the coelacanth and lungfish. And so the coelacanth was rediscovered in the fossil record. It was known for a long time off Madagascar in the 30s. And then more recently, this is filmed off Sulawesi. So there's the muscle and bone in the fins. Actually, one of the graduate students' wives found it in a fish market in Manado in Sulawesi, one of Roy Caldwell's grad students here in integrative biology. So muscle and bone. And what's critical about it is that in this lineage, 1 bone, 2 bones, 1 bone, 2 bones, 1 bone, 2 bones, 1 bone, 2 bones. So the configuration of bones, there are lots of things that have bones in their fins in the Devonian, but this lineage has the pattern that corresponds to us. And then I'm going to concentrate on Acanthostega here, which is the first tetrapod, because it's the first thing that has 4 pods, 4 feet. Interestingly, it's got 8 digits, not 5. So we settle down on 5 fairly quickly in evolution, but it takes a few million years before we settle down on that stereotype, and then some groups lose more after that. Don't know why the reason for that. So what's interesting is that here's a picture of Acanthostega. It's a tetrapod. It's got 4 feet with multiple toes, but it's got a full set of gills. It's got a tail fin. It's got lateral lines that only operate underwater as a sensory system. So this thing clearly evolved for life in water. Limbs did not evolve for evolution on land. They evolved for evolution in water, presumably walking on the substrate or bracing themselves for predation. So this transition looks like pre-adaptation played a major role. I think for land plants it didn't play a major role, which is why it took tens of millions of years. This one took, just 5 to 10 million years, not 20 or 30 or 50 million years. So sometimes pre-adaptation is critical. Sometimes you have to actually get onto land and then you wait for the right variation or selective pressures, don't know which, and then you wait for the next one and then you wait for the next one. So this one, pre-adaptation, is pretty important. Okay, first mammals now. About 250 million years ago. So very, very late in the history of the planet. After the end Permian mass extinction, I show this slide because dinosaurs and mammals both originated about the same time, about 225, 240 million years ago. And then for most of the history of mammals, they evolved in the shadow of the dinosaurs. And to give you a sense of geologic time, it is more accurate to have a T-Rex figured with a modern human than it is to have T-Rex with a Stegosaurus. T-Rex with a human's only an error of 65 million years. T-Rex with a Stegosaurus is an error of 100. Right, so for 165 million years, dinosaurs dominate the ecology of the terrestrial biosphere, and mammals remain small and insignificant. The reason why that's important is it looks like it was the extinction of the dinosaurs that led to the ecological release that leads to the evolution of mammals into us. No KT bolide event, no us. Yeah.
Were mammals small and insignificant, or just small? Was there a lot of them? Or?
They're not a lot in the fossil record. As you go down in body size, numbers tend to go up, so they may have been significant at small body sizes.
Like biomass or something like that?
Yeah, so, like any other small species, there are lots of other small things out there at the time.
I mean, like cumulative mammal biomass, was it like sort of equal to dinosaurs, or?
I don't actually know what the mass relationship is as you get out of the body size thing. I know what the scaling is, but I don't know what the numbers look like. But they're really rare in the fossil record. But there are lots of small-bodied things, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, that are much more abundant than mammals. I think one of the things that happened is that birds, crocodiles, etc. took the daylight, and mammals took the night. The earliest fossil mammals have little pits in their noses that look like they're receptacles for whiskers. So my suspicion is that fur evolved first for helping sense in the nighttime. So I think mammals took the night, the other reptiles took the daytime, and then the fur coat was to help insulate for the night. And then if you're endothermic, you can operate at night where the other things can't. So I suspect that's the origin of the fur, etc. So then a meteorite, an Mount Everest-sized meteorite strikes the Earth to end the reign of the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. Debris is now found globally. This is again another set of discoveries at Berkeley, which is rather spectacular. The first was Denmark, the second was New Zealand, and I've forgotten where the first was Italy, then New Zealand, then Denmark. Took a long time to find the crater. Turns out it's in the Yucatan Peninsula. This is really just gratuitous fun. There's the crater there. Can you all see it? It's had 65 million years to fill in with sediment. So there's part of the edge there. Notice there are highlands here. Gravity anomaly map shows the crater walls. So it's got a double ring structure. These white dots are actually artesian wells. So the water flows off the highlands, hits the crater wall, and then flows to the surface. So you can see the evidence of the structure. So emergence of humans, of Homo, about 2 million years ago, is obviously sort of in a blink of an eye geologically, which is incredible, right? Just incredible. Fossil record is reasonably rich, very controversial as to who's actually ancestral to whom, as opposed to independent lineages. So we don't know, and what I want to do here is just pick two fossils, Lucy and the Narukatomi boy, to show you that just with a couple of fossils you can help trace the transition from early hominins to us. This is the oldest fossil now at about 6.57 million years, which is pushing back the need for the molecular clock dates, which we're coming in at more like 4.5 to 5.5. And then, of course, there's the recent discovery of the hobbits in Flores in Indonesia, which do look like they're legitimate fossils. So there's Lucy, Ethiopia, slightly older rocks, fossil footprints indicating bipedality, a bunch of individuals walking in a row and then one off to the side, and an early fossil horse going past. Narukatomi boy, he's about 10 or 12 years old based on the tooth eruption. He's 5'10" already. So one of the things that seems to happen in the invention of agriculture, we've gone through a dwarfing stage. So it looks like our precursors were much taller and gracile. Once you invent agriculture, then you invent plagues and food shortages, and you shrink body size to deal with that. And so you can order, with there's Lucy, there's Narukatomi boy, there's a chimp, and there's us, and you can sort of order the transitions. Bipedality, then the low broad pelvis, then the barrel chest and long legs, then the chin, large brain, and probably language. New fossils change our view. This is Ardipithecus from Tim White, also at Berkeley, showing the last common ancestors of humans and chimps was neither human nor chimp-like. So phylogenetics is great. Take a human, take a chimp, work out what the average is, and that's the ancestor. Fossil record often shows that the ancestor is more complex than that. Okay, so here it is again. Now see if you can spot the key events. Big bang stuff here, yeah, sure. So molten surface early, heavy bombardment, an especially big one, creates the moon. Cools down enough for the oceans. They've got origin of cells first, I think, and then the genetic information. Fine, prokaryotic worlds, multicellular. This is precursor and then Cambrian explosion, which I'll deal with next time. And then origin of vertebrates. And what they've done here, which I think is fairly nice, is put the Katie bolide in there, which is necessary for the emergence of the mammals. And then I didn't talk about the emergence of primates about 5 million years ago. And then the last bit. One of the things that's been tricky in this business is there's sort of a discordance often between the fossil record and molecular clock estimates. So the major mammal groups in the fossil record appear after the death of the dinosaurs, but molecular clock shows most of them predating the death of the dinosaurs. And so Simon Tavare, the GTR model, and I and a bunch of colleagues published a paper a number of years ago in Nature, where we showed if you look at the incompleteness of the fossil record, it looks like the lineages based on the fossil record does in fact predate the Katie boundary. But my suspicion is they're all small ratty looking things. And then multiple lineages cross the Katie boundary and then with the ecological release become rodents or rabbits or primates, etc. So the fossil record and the molecular clocks measure simply divergence of lineages. They don't measure when you get the acquisition of unique biologies. So angiosperms diverged from their nearest living relatives in the Triassic about 250 million years ago. But it looks like it takes about 100 million years between that event and the evolution of flowers as a reproductive organ and the invention of fruit. Okay, 2 minutes to go. Questions?
So we can push the stop
Yeah.
before the break.
Why did the bombardment stop? Was it just a
just-
universe-wide thing?
It's a solar system-wide thing. You start off with all this debris and the small particles coalesce into larger particles gravitationally and the larger ones into planetesimals and the planetesimals into planets. And then gravitationally, then the biggest objects just start sucking in all the other objects. And it looks like it takes a couple 100 million years to basically suck in most of those objects. But we still see debris coming down, meteorites, meteors in the sky, meteorites. So there's still a little bit of debris out there, which has not yet been sucked into the sun or the major planets. But basically it's just sucking it dry gravitationally. Yeah. So what concerns me is, did it stop 4 billion years ago? Was it 4.2 billion years ago? Almost impossible to know those numbers.
So they say life evolved once because it's all DNA based, right?
So they say life evolved once. I think the correct way of saying it is that all living things on Earth appear to be derived from a single last common ancestor. That doesn't mean that life didn't evolve several times and either was wiped out by the early bombardment or was consumed by the life that we have now today.
So my question is, these various changes that happen, say, evolution of birds, reptiles, mammals, did those things happen multiple times or once? And do we have any way of telling?
Oh, that's easy. Yeah, we know that very, very easily. So, multicellular animals, which include everything that has a backbone, so birds, lizards, snakes, humans, fish, and includes then all the invertebrate groups, clams, snails, corals, sponges, etc., have one single origin. And those body plans emerged during the Cambrian explosion, which would be my second talk.
Yeah, but the littler pieces inside it, reptiles become amphibians, becoming reptiles, becoming mammals.
Yeah. What?
I mean, did that happen multiple times or once or?
No. Each of those transitions look like theirs unique. A single origin of birds, a single origin of mammals, a single origin of lizards, and from within them snakes.
I mean, that's kind of how we define them.
We do now. Yeah.
It's interesting that you can now we would base everything, we define it that way, like it's everybody who shares a single common ancestor. But it does happen to match up very well with what people thought before they even knew that things had a common ancestor, just based on morphological characters.
Yeah. So the rule of thumb now is you can't name a group unless you think all the members shared a single last common ancestor. And if you think it evolves independently twice, then they each get a separate name. And then Linnaeus obviously invented the classification before we knew about evolution, and it turns out that most of Linnaeus's categories hold up. And part of it is we're incredibly complicated, and so the chances that you get birds evolving independently twice with all the minute details of their anatomy, etc., is essentially zero, which is why Linnaeus got it right.
So there's nothing inevitable about each of these. I mean, if it's inevitable, it could happen multiple times at different places.
Well, unless the invention of it then precludes it happening again by poisoning the waters. So for example, if I'm the first bird and I'm a really bad bird, it doesn't matter, there's nothing competing with me. I get to be a really effective bird. Anything that then starts to become a bird of bird.
Earth is huge, it doesn't happen multiple times.
Yeah, but species spread globally very, very rapidly. So we'll look at these issues with respect to the Cambrian explosion. And so I think there is a degree of repeatability, which I'm going to argue with the Cambrian explosion. I'm going to try and set up an intellectual framework to explain that. So we'll deal with that after the break.
I think it's a bit of both. Most people would say, just to amplify on that. Like you're saying, we don't think that life is evolving. We don't expect life to evolve again because the current life will outcompete it, right? So even if it was something,
or consume the precursors.
Now we'll never let it happen. But like birds, okay, if your definition of a bird is just like flying around, it's like big, bats evolve completely separately.
So let me give you an analogy. I mean, in math, big theorems happen about the same time by two different people.
Yeah, right.
So it's inevitable that it should happen in that sense.
Yeah, so there's a controversy which I think's mostly settled now as to whether vertebrates invaded land 2 or 3 times simultaneously at about the same time. And there's certainly, if you forget about the details, there are 3 groups of vertebrates that have invented powered flight. There's birds, there's bats, and then there's the pterosaurs. And to the eye, they look completely different. You have no trouble recognizing, but that's 3 different origins at 3 different times. Yeah, okay.
Sorry, sorry about that. Very inopportune. Yeah. Sorry, you mentioned the formation of the moon and simultaneously the tilt on the axis.
Yeah.
Do either of those, are they? You just sort of mention that out of interest, or is that sort of something that played some crucial role in the development of life?
Well, I'm just struck. I mean, it's mostly out of interest, but I'm sort of struck by the fact that. Why does eyesight develop? Why does photoreception develop? And so initially, the first things that had photoreception presumably couldn't form any image of its kind. So I think there's 2 types of signal you pick up. The first is night-day, which has nothing to do with the moon. And the second one has to do with lunar cycles. And so I think the fact that we have tides, which probably affects nutrient concentrations, and the fact that we have lunar cycles is because we have a moon. So some of our circadian rhythms, which are still with us 4.5 billion years later, date to that time. So it's a little bit gratuitous. The other thing which I didn't say, which I will say now, is it looks like it's crucial that you have active tectonics in order to have life. If we stop tectonics now, it'd take about 10,000 years to scrub the CO2 out of the atmosphere, processes of weathering. CO2 dissolves in water, becomes bicarb, slight acid interacts with calcium silicate rocks, turns to limestone. And it would take about 300,000 years to degas the ocean. And after that, no CO2, period. So it looks like you've got to have a planet big enough that's warm enough to maintain it. So Mars looks like it had plate tectonics for about 1 billion years. 1 billion years. There's a string of volcanoes in a line, it looks like it, and then it just froze. Too small, less uranium in its core. So now the waiting times matter. So it wouldn't surprise me if there had been life on Mars, and when it froze, core stopped rotating, less protection from the magnetic field, and no plate tectonics anymore, so no return of CO2 out of the mantle. Boom, it dies. Which is kind of interesting.
So
Okay,
I
I
just
the
I
last
was
question.
impressed very much. Oh, sorry, he was pointing at me. There was somebody-
Yeah, I was. Yeah, but I don't know who wins, the chair or the speaker. Last question.
The last question, Jeff.
No, it was you.
It was you.
Well, I just recently I've had contact with a bunch of people involved with Kepler and those things, and the count just goes up every day, and on the new potential planetary systems, and I was very impressed by the fact that you actually conjectured that life happened very early, still when things were quite chaotic actually and violent. And so I just wonder what your own reflections are about all these planetary systems.
Yeah, so again, I think it was Marcy here leading the term. It now looks like 1 in 5 stars, I think they sampled about 20, 1 in 5 stars has an Earth-like planet going around it. 1 in 5 stars. So that means in each galaxy there's an order of 1 billion Earth-like planets. And some of them are called super-Earths, they're bigger than this one, so tectonics is no problem. Some of them are going to be Mars-sized, so they're going to freeze out. So I think there are bazillions of Earth-like planets out there in our galaxy, and there's billions of galaxies, right? Feeling like Carl Sagan here. So I think life is abundant in the universe, really abundant. And I think it's easy, it's kind of a funny inversion of the anthropic principle, which is, I think, the waiting time, the evidence of life occurs almost as soon as we can see it geologically, which suggests it had to have occurred fairly quickly. And the fact that it's here, if we waited 2.5 billion years to get to the origin of life, then I would have said it's hard. So the emergence of humans is hard because you've got to wait for almost 4.5 billion years to get to the emergence of humans. So that waiting time is awful. But the waiting time for first life is fairly short. So I suspect life is relatively easier. But I wouldn't dare write, I don't know how I'd write that down scientifically. Okay.
Thank you very much. So I would suggest we meet 5 minutes after 10 again.